Hello everyone, it's Father Hayes, and we are continuing our series of videos on the Mass, and in particular our series of videos focusing on the Eucharistic prayer and unpacking the Eucharistic prayer. This video that we're going to do now and then the next video are really going to get into kind of the heart of the Eucharistic prayer, but also really tackle some of the deeper theology behind the Eucharistic prayer and behind the Mass itself. So I'll do my best to condense as much as I can into these short video presentations. My primary resource for these particular videos is again the book Praying the Mass, The Prayers of the Priest by Father Jeffrey Pinion, and this is available at different booksellers including Amazon. So there's this book, and then there's a companion, The Prayers of the People. But this really can touch on some of the theology that I'm not able to touch on in these videos. So let's move forward. So right now in this video, what I want to talk about is the consecration. And within the consecration, there are several elements. We have what we call the institution narratives, the words of institution, which are contained in the institution narrative, and then the elevation. So the institution narrative immediately follows from the epiclesis. And it's there that in the institution narrative that the priest recounts the actions of Jesus at the Last Supper. So our first source for this information actually doesn't come from the Gospels. It comes from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians. And then each of the Gospels gives us a similar account. So we have 5 scriptural accounts that we draw from and base the prayers of the institution narrative on. Now there's a particular pattern that is followed in the institution narrative. And the pattern is this, that Jesus takes bread, he gives thanks, he says the blessing, breaks the bread, and then gives it to his disciples. So for example, we see here in Eucharistic Prayer 3, it says, "For on the night he was betrayed," so we're talking about the events of the Last Supper, "he himself took bread, and giving you thanks, he said the blessing, broke the bread, and gave it to his disciples." And then it goes into the actual words of consecration. So this is an important pattern that we follow. Taking bread, giving thanks, saying the blessing, breaking the bread, and then distributing it to his apostles, to his disciples. So within the context of the Mass, we could see the taking of the bread as beginning in the offertory rite, where the bread is offered. Then the giving thanks we saw in the preface. If you remember the video we did on the preface was giving God thanks for the great gifts that he gives us. Then the saying of the blessing, as I said, is the words of consecration. We'll talk about in a second. The breaking of the bread we'll get to in a little while in what we call the fracturing rite. And then finally, the giving of the bread is what we know as the communion rite, receiving communion. And then this is ended, this institution narrative is ended with the words of our Lord, "Do this in memory of me," which is understood under a kind of unusual, an unfamiliar word for many of us called anamnesis. In our next video, we'll talk about anamnesis, that what do we mean by doing this in memory of our Lord? So in the words of consecration, we now move from the priest giving a narrative of what our Lord does at the Last Supper to essentially lending his voice to God himself, to Christ himself, where the priest is in the richest element of his acting in persona Christi. He says the words of consecration over the bread and over the chalice of wine and water. So it's important for us to recognize that this changing of it being speaking as Christ rather than of Christ. And what is even more critically important is to recognize that within this, a very significant event happens called Transubstantiation, which I'll talk about in a second. But the thing that we want to really emphasize is that none of this is symbolic. None of this is symbolic. This is very real. God the Son acting through the ministerial priest to make present this sacrifice, and we'll talk about that in more detail. So, transubstantiation, what do we mean by that? Well, what begins before the institution narrative, before the Eucharistic prayer, is, as we talked about before in previous videos, ordinary bread and ordinary wine, the fruits of the earth. These ordinary bread and the wine mixed with water will be transformed. Their substance will be changed. Now, they'll still look like bread. They'll still taste like bread. They'll still feel like bread and wine. So this is an important theological concept that the Church teaches. And again, Christianity is the only one that makes this claim. That bread, the substance of the bread, after the words of consecration, is a completely different substance. It's the substance of the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, in the fullness of his body, blood, soul, and divinity. The fullness of the two natures coming together at the Incarnation. The chalice with the wine and the water mingled together. Before the words of consecration, it's water and wine. Following the words of consecration, the substance is now no longer water and wine. It's Jesus Christ fully in his body, blood, soul, and divinity. But the accidents, the appearance, the taste, the texture of bread and wine remain the same. The other important thing that we want to focus on is another fancy word, concomitants. Concomitants. Basically what that means is that Christ is fully present in the bread, in the consecrated bread, the host, and he is fully present in the chalice. So, for example, sometimes people who have gluten issues, when they come forward to receive communion, they might receive from the chalice. That is Jesus Christ, fully body, blood, soul, and divinity. In a similar way, if we're only distributing the host, people are not missing out on part of Jesus because they're just receiving the host. Rather, Jesus is fully present in his humanity and in his divinity in the host. So that's concomitants. Finally, as part of the consecration, following the words of consecration for the bread and then for the chalice, then the priest will elevate first the host and then the chalice. I don't have props here to show you this, but I'm sure you recognize it from other masses. So this is very important, very subtle, but very important point as well, because the priest is lifting up the Eucharist, and he's lifting up the chalice so that they may be seen and adored. So it's a moment of adoration. So we would never, ever simply adore bread. We would never adore a chalice with water and wine. Never, ever. So even in that very simple moment, some priests will elevate the host a little bit longer, some a little bit less. But in that moment, it's a moment for the host to be seen by the congregation and to be adored. And it recalls to us as well that as Jesus is lifted up on the cross at his crucifixion, now at the Mass, he is once more being lifted up, to, as he says, to draw all men to himself. So this is really also kind of leading into what we're going to talk about in the next video about anamnesis, of making that reality of Calvary present to us here at the Mass. We'll see you in our next video. May God be with you.